Somewhere right now, a person is walking down a street, eyes locked on a small blue dot on their phone. That dot claims to know exactly where they are, down to a few meters. They never question it, they just follow it. Now rewind. No blue dot, no satellites, not even paper. Just you, wherever here happens to be, and no way to prove it. 200,000 years ago, humans wandered the earth with no record of where they'd been, or how to get back. One wrong turn in unfamiliar territory could mean days without food, or worse. And yet, somehow, humans learned to hold entire landscapes inside a single skull. This is the story of how a species with nothing but memory learned to draw the world. But it's also a story with a darker thread running through it. The moment a memory became a mark, someone else could claim it, cross it, or fight over it. A map was never just directions. From the very beginning, it was also a claim. Clue 1. Humans are freakishly good at remembering landmarks. A leaning tree, a strange rock, a bend in a river. This is called spatial memory, and it's older than language itself. Clue 2. The sky. Before written words, the sun by day and the stars by night quietly told direction. Certain star patterns stayed fixed enough, night after night, to become natural compasses. Clue 3. Storytelling. A returning hunter didn't just remember a route, he described it, out loud, to everyone around the fire. One person's memory, spoken aloud, became the group's shared map, long before anyone drew a single line. But a spoken map had a flaw. Whoever told the story controlled the route, and controlled who got to follow it. Memory fades, stories get twisted in the retelling. And no one lives forever, which meant, sooner or later, someone had to try something new. Turning a memory into a mark. Not writing. Writing didn't exist yet. Just a shape scratched onto something that wouldn't rot or forget. The first mark ever scratched into bone wasn't just a memory aid. It was the first time direction itself could be owned. On a mammoth-tusk in what's now the Czech Republic, someone carved lines, said to represent mountains, rivers, and travel routes. Some researchers date it to roughly 25,000 years ago. If they're right, it may be the oldest known map on Earth. Thousands of years later, in what's now Ukraine, another mammoth bone was carved, marking out an entire settlement. In caves in France, some believe dots connected across the ceiling weren't decoration. They may be some of the oldest known star charts, roughly 17,000 years old. Whether or not every one of these truly counts as a map, one thing was clear. Humans had started turning space into symbols. On the other side of the world, in what's now China, people were carving maps onto wood and silk over 2,000 years ago. Excavated military maps from Fangmatan show rivers, roads, and mountain passes, drawn not out of curiosity, but so an army could move through the right valley. A government that could map its farmland could also tax it. A government that could map a mountain pass could also defend it, or attack through it. Rewind further back thousands of years earlier, in Mesopotamia, someone pressed a stylus into wet clay, and made something unmistakably map-shaped. A tablet found at Qasr shows a river valley, hills as overlapping half-circles, rivers as straight lines, cities as simple circles. It even labeled who owned which plot of land. Arguably the world's oldest surviving property dispute, settled in clay. Around 600 BCE, the Babylonians etched an entire world onto a tablet, barely the size of your palm. Their world was a flat disk, ringed by an ocean they called the Bitter River, with their own city proudly placed at the center. Every civilization that drew a map, it turned out, drew itself at the middle of it. On the other side of the planet entirely, Pacific Islanders were building maps, out of something no one else was using, sticks and shells. These stick charts didn't show coastlines at all. They mapped ocean swells, currents, and wave patterns, memorized, then carried by hand across open sea. A Polynesian navigator could read the ocean itself, the way a scholar read a coastline, no coastline required. On the other side of the world, Aboriginal Australians had built a different kind of map entirely, not an object, but a song. Each songline traced the path of an ancestor spirit across the land, verse by verse, landmark by landmark. Sing the verses in the right order, and you could walk hundreds of kilometers of unfamiliar desert without ever losing your way. Some songlines were said to be mirrored in the stars, so the night sky itself became a second, matching map overhead. It may be one of the oldest continuously used navigation systems on Earth, still sung, and still walked, today. Half a world away, around North America's Great Lakes, other mapmakers carved their routes into bark instead. Anishinaabe and Cree mapmakers etched rivers, portage trails, and hunting grounds directly onto sheets of birch bark. These weren't decoration. Traders and travelers followed them, stroke, for hundreds of miles. A song, a woven lattice of sticks, a strip of scratch bark, completely different materials, completely different continents, the exact same instinct. However humans got there, they all got to the same idea: memory needs a shape. Back in Rome, the empire mapped something else entirely. Not oceans, not stars, but roads. The arteries an empire needed to move soldiers and grain. The result, a scroll over 6 meters long, showed the entire road network of the empire stretched into a single, distorted ribbon. Meanwhile in Egypt, a papyrus scroll was drawn to guide workers to a gold mining region. In Greece, a philosopher named Anaximander drew what's considered the first known map of the entire known world, a circular disk floating in an endless sea. Not long after, another Greek thinker proposed something wilder. Maybe the world wasn't flat at all. Maybe it was a sphere. 3 centuries later, a scholar named Eratosthenes tried to measure something that sounded impossible: the circumference of the entire planet. His tools, to sticks, to shadows, and basic geometry. No satellites, no modern instruments, just sunlight and math. His result was off from the true measurement by roughly 2%, a staggering feat for a man who never left the ground. Meanwhile, half a world away, in Han Dynasty China, an equally rigorous mapping tradition had already been developing for centuries. In 168 BCE, 3 silk maps were folded and sealed inside a nobleman's tomb near Changsha, left undisturbed for over 2,000 years. One was a topographic map, drawn to a consistent scale, with mountain ranges rendered almost like modern contour lines. None of this borrowed a single idea from Ptolemy, or from anyone around the Mediterranean. It grew from its own separate mathematical tradition, entirely on its own. Roughly 4 centuries later, a Zheng dynasty minister named Peizu inherited his empire's old maps and wasn't impressed. Around 267 CE, he set down 6 formal rules for making an accurate map: fixed scale, true orientation, measured distance, and honest corrections for a landscape's rise, fall, and curve. Later historians would nickname him the Ptolemy of China, a title he earned without ever once hearing the name Ptolemy. His 6 principles would go on to guide Chinese mapmaking for close to 1,000 years, the same way Ptolemy's grid was about to guide Europe's. 2 empires, on opposite ends of the map, had arrived at the same idea from scratch: that place could be pinned down by number, not only by memory. But knowing the Earth's true shape didn't stop kings from wanting to know exactly which parts of it were theirs. The more precisely land could be measured, the more precisely it could be taxed, defended, or taken from someone else. Centuries later, a scholar named Ptolemy took things even further, laying an invisible grid of numbers across the entire known world. He systemized a grid others had proposed: latitude and longitude, a way to pin any place on Earth to a precise coordinate, the same basic idea GPS uses today. His work, Geographia, became the gold standard. For over 1,000 years, mapmakers treated his word as close to gospel. When Rome fell, it wasn't Europe that kept Ptolemy's grid alive. It was scholars in the Islamic world, translating and refining his coordinates for centuries. In the 1100s, a scholar named Al-Idrisi combined dozens of these traditions into one of the most advanced maps the world had ever seen, commissioned by a king who wanted the whole known world on a single silver disk. For the first time, trade routes, coastlines, and cities from Spain to China were combined into a single, continuously updated picture, kept accurate specifically because merchants and sailors kept sending corrections back. By now, humanity had gone from scratches on a tusk to a mathematically gridded model of the entire known world. Confident, methodical, backed by centuries of careful, layered observation. It would be easy to assume that from here, maps only got more accurate, more trustworthy, more right. Right. Ptolemy's grid was a genuine masterpiece. But after Rome fell, much of Europe simply stopped using it. For centuries afterward, European mapmakers weren't primarily interested in where things were, they were interested in what things meant. These maps were called mapae mundi, cloths of the world, and they were drawn less like geography and more like theology. The largest one that survives, made in England around the year 1300, put the city of Jerusalem dead center. East, not north, sat at the top of the map, toward the rising sun, and toward the Garden of Eden. It packed in hundreds of drawings, cities, Bible scenes, strange animals, and creatures said to live at the far edges of the known world. It wasn't built for a sailor trying to find his way home. It was built to teach an entire worldview at a glance, which meant that for actual open water navigation, a map like this was nearly useless. So out on the Mediterranean, sailors built something almost completely different, and almost overnight. The oldest surviving example, known today as the cartography, appears around 1290 with no rough draft or earlier version ever found before it. These portolan charts were covered in crisscrossing rum lines radiating out from compass roses, built from sailors' own compass bearings. No mythical monsters, no Jerusalem at the center. Just coastlines, harbors, and headings, drawn with startling accuracy for their time. A captain could lay a straight edge across the chart, read off a bearing, and steer by it directly, something no mappamundi could ever offer him. Two completely different philosophies of mapmaking, existing side by side in the very same century. One explained what the world meant, the other explained the way home. The age of exploration was about to need both, because history was about to prove something uncomfortable. Being backed by kings, scholars, and centuries of tradition doesn't automatically mean being correct. Fast forward more than 1,000 years. As ships got bigger and empires got hungrier, maps stopped being just descriptions of the world. They became weapons. Decades before Europe drew its famous line, a fleet unlike anything the world had ever seen was already sailing the Indian Ocean. Starting in 1405, the Chinese Admiral Zheng led 7 voyages for the Ming Dynasty, commanding fleets of over 300 ships and nearly 28,000 men. His largest ships were said to stretch over 120 meters, carrying navigators, translators, and detailed nautical charts of their own. The fleet reached Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the coast of East Africa decades before Columbus ever left Spain. But China's court chose not to turn those charts into conquest or colonies the way European courts soon would. After the 7th voyage, a new emperor scaled the program back, and China's great treasure fleets were never sent out again. The same tool, a detailed chart of the wider world, led to empires down to very different paths. The spark for all of this was an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus. In 1492, working from a map that badly underestimated the size of the Earth, Columbus sailed west hoping for a shortcut to Asia. He never reached Asia. He reached islands no European map had ever recorded, and insisted, wrongly, that he had anyway. In 1494, 2 years after Columbus set sail, Spain and Portugal did something almost absurd. They drew a single line down a map of the entire unexplored world. Everything on one side belonged to Spain, everything on the other belonged to Portugal. Nobody asked the millions of people already living there. 25 years later, on the Spanish side of that same line, conquistadors marched into a city already more sophisticated than most maps back home. Hernan Cortes and his men entered the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1519, the city its own mapmakers may have already charted in precise detail. A map like it was printed in Europe in 1524. Historians believe it was based on a local original, making it one of the very first non-European maps most Europeans had ever seen. A conquest justified partly by a European line on a map illustrated in Europe by a far better map that may have been made by the very people being conquered. Meanwhile, a Portuguese captain named Ferdinand Magellan set out to test something no one had ever proven firsthand, that a ship could sail all the way around the globe. Magellan himself never finished the journey. He was killed partway through, in the Philippines, in 1521, but in 1522, one battered ship out of his original 5 limped back into Spain, the first vessel to ever circle the entire planet, proving the mapmakers' globes had been right all along. From that point on, an accurate map wasn't a convenience. It was a fortune, and a target. Portugal treated its most detailed navigation charts as closely guarded state secrets, punishable by death to leak. Whoever held the best map controlled the richest trade route. So spies, rival sailors, and pirates didn't just steal gold, they stole rolled-up charts. A wrong coastline could sink a fleet. A right one could make an empire. As European powers pushed further, their mapmakers didn't just record new coastlines. They claimed them, planting flags on paper before anyone from that land had agreed to anything. Entire continents got redrawn in palaces thousands of miles away, long before the people living there ever saw the new lines. By the late 1800s, this reached its most extreme point. European leaders met in Berlin and divided up an entire continent using rulers and straight lines. Not a single African representative was invited to that table. Ethnic groups were split in half, rival kingdoms were fused into one colony, all because of decisions made over a map, far away. Maps built empires, and, quietly, they also planted the seeds of conflicts that would outlast those empires by generations. But even as maps became tools of conquest, they still carried the same old flaw from 1,000 years earlier. They were only as good as the last person who copied them. None of this started with random sailors, either. It started with a royal program, built specifically to turn mapmaking into a weapon of state. In the 1400s, Portugal's royal court, under Prince Henry, began systematically organizing and funding these voyages, sending expedition after expedition down the African coast, each one correcting and improving the last map. The charts that came back were stamped, numbered, and locked away. Because in this era, the most dangerous weapon in the world wasn't a sword. It was an accurate coastline. For over 1,000 years after Ptolemy, almost nobody checked his work. They just kept copying it. And Ptolemy had made a massive error. He drew the Indian Ocean as a sea completely landlocked, sealed off by imaginary coastline. That mistake got copied, generation after generation, by scholars who trusted his authority more than their own eyes. And it wasn't only isolated scholars getting things wrong. Centuries later, some of Europe's most funded, most respected mapmakers made an error even stranger. For over 100 years, starting in the 1600s, official maps confidently drew California as an island. One early explorer misread the coastline. Cartographers copied his map without checking. Then other cartographers copied those cartographers. Some ships were even sent hunting for a strait around this imaginary island that never existed and never made the crossing they expected. Even after later explorers walked the actual land and reported it was clearly attached to the mainland, some mapmakers kept printing it as an island anyway. It took decades of first-hand correction before the island of California was fully erased from official maps. Kings funded these expeditions, scholars signed off on these maps, and still, a basic geographic error survived for generations, unquestioned. And once the printing press arrived, this problem didn't shrink, it multiplied. A single mistake could now be copied not by one scribe, but by thousands of printed pages at once. Accuracy and error were now traveling at exactly the same speed, which means the measure it, chart it, trust the expert's system, however impressive, was never actually foolproof for anyone, peasant or king. This is the real twist. It wasn't one accurate map that got humanity here. Not a tusk, not a grid, not a coastline. It was centuries of copied mistakes, slow corrections, stubborn belief in authority, and the occasional lucky accident stacked on top of each other. Memory, storytelling, geometry, coordinates, empire, correction. None of it was ever fully right. Together, it was eventually right enough. California wasn't even the strangest ghost on the map. For nearly 100 years, official maps of West Africa showed a massive mountain range that simply never existed. It was called the Mountains of Kong, invented from a single explorer's vague, second-hand account, then copied onto map after map by cartographers who had never gone near the place. It wasn't erased until the late 1800s, when an actual expedition walked straight through where the mountains were supposed to be, and found flat, open land. Centuries of copied errors like these eventually became too expensive and too dangerous to leave uncorrected. In the 1670s, France's King Louis XIV commissioned the astronomer Cassini and his family to do something no one had ever fully done: measure the entire kingdom, point by point. Their method was triangulation, using precise angles between hilltop stations to lock every town into place on one single, unbroken grid. It took for generations of the Cassini family, and more than a century, to finish. When the finished survey was compared to the kingdom's old official maps, the results embarrassed the crown. France turned out to be smaller than anyone had claimed. Louis XIV is said to have joked that his own astronomers had cost him more territory than any enemy army ever had. It was the first time an entire nation had been measured, not estimated, and it set the template every accurate map since has followed. Even today's maps carry a version of this same problem, hiding in plain sight. Most world maps you've seen use something called the Mercator projection, and it quietly distorts the entire planet. On it, Greenland looks roughly the same size as Africa. In reality, Africa is about 14 times larger. It's not a mistake exactly, It's a 400-year-old trade-off made for sailors that most of us never questioned and just inherited. But that sailors' trade-off did something else too. It made Europe and North America look bigger, while shrinking the very regions European empires had once colonized. In the 1970s, a mapmaker named Arno Peters pushed back, publishing a projection built to show every country's true relative size. It sparked a genuine, decades-long argument about whether a simple line on a map could ever really be neutral. Turns out, a line on a map can still start an argument. Even in a century with satellites, every map you've ever trusted, from a tusk to a touchscreen, has been a version of good enough for now, never fully finished, never fully true. That's not a flaw in mapmaking. That basically is mapmaking. Even the apps on your phone still make quiet choices about what counts as a border, whose name a disputed region gets, and which version different countries are shown. A satellite in orbit is neutral. The line drawn from its data almost never is. That same hunger for precision would eventually leave the ground entirely. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite ever put into orbit, and physicists on the ground noticed something strange in its radio signal. As Sputnik moved, the signal's pitch rose, then fell, the Doppler effect. From that shift alone, they could calculate exactly where the satellite was. Then came the reverse idea. If you already knew exactly where the satellite was, that same signal could tell you exactly where you were. The US Navy built on that idea to secretly track its ballistic missile submarines, calling the system Transit. For years it stayed a classified military tool, refined quietly through the Cold War. A civilian airliner's tragic loss in 1983, later traced to a navigation error, sped up the push to open the system to everyone, not just the military. A discovery about a beeping Soviet satellite in 1957 is the direct ancestor of the blue dot glowing on your phone today. Which brings us back to that blue dot on your phone. It's built from satellites, atomic clocks, and decades of engineering most of us will never fully understand. And yet, underneath all of it, it's doing the exact same thing a hunter did around a fire 200,000 years ago, turning I remember the way into something someone else can follow. And it's still quietly doing that other, older job too. Right now, somewhere, that same mapping technology is helping draw new borders and settle new disputes, the oldest task a map ever had. So next time you glance at a map without thinking twice, look a little closer. Behind that glowing dot is an unbroken line of tusks, tablets, coastlines, empires, and quiet corrections, stretching back further than anyone can fully picture.